Howdy y'all, this is Dwight and welcome back to my channel. Well, for this video I'm going to be doing me an experiment, and I thought I'd bring y'all along for the ride. So it might be a success or we might crash and burn, create a big old gom. Never can tell what we got going on, but we're going to give it a whirl. Well, what am I experimenting, may you ask? I'm experimenting on a different method of creating clearance. Let me get something to point with here. Got me a blade here. Okay, what I like to do is keep the pivot part of my tang, which is this square right here, the same thickness as my back spring. And I've showed on a previous video where I take my blade to the belt grinder and I thin from the front part of this square I have drawn out forward a little bit, and then I commence to grind my bevels. Now, for some folk, that is understandably a little bit difficult to do because everybody's hands are built different. I'm blessed or cursed with my mom's side of the family of bone structure, so my fingers aren't super thick and whatnot, whereas my dad, he was a big bone man and his pinky finger was probably as big around as my thumb. He had great big hands. Of course, he worked in the construction, so he put them to good use, but I got smaller bone structures, so I'm able to hold the blade and manipulate it a little bit easier than somebody with a larger hand structure. So I've come up, well, I ain't come up with it, let me take that back. I have heard of another knife maker that takes his blades to the surface grinder and he will surface grind right in front of the tang square forward, just enough to create clearance in this area right here from the kick upwards. So whenever the blade closes, there's clearance in this area. But the pivot part of his tang is still the same thickness of his back spring. Now, that gentleman has one of those standalone surface grinders, you know, with a proper surface grinder. Whereas I got an attachment for my Ameribraid belt grinder. And there's, I'm sure, a number of other makers that use an attachment for their belt grinder as well. Well, problem with that is the belt is pretty wide. And I got a belt right here. 2-inch wide, of course, 2x72 belt grinder. Okay, from that line, it ain't going to do the whole blade if you do it like this, but the surface that the blade goes onto, say the magnetic chuck of the attachment, that's cutting it awful close. So I'm planning on ripping this belt in half, and that will be a little bit closer to, say, the surface grinder with a width of one of those rocks, which is basically just what you need from this area to give or take in this area, which gives a lot more support along the blade to prevent a little bit of warpage as it's happening. Of course, your first thought would be loading this traditional on your magnetic chuck and trying to create a stop to where you can precisely stop here. Of course, on a attachment, you're going to have that round wheel and there's going to be a radius right here. So I'm worried that will radius be too big is what I'm thinking. I want more of a cleaner edge. Now I'm going to be using a 400 grit belt. It's got some wear on it. I ain't using a new one because I don't want to rip a new belt in half unless I know this is going to work proper. But it still has grit on it. And now, 400 grit belt obviously is not near as thick as a 36 grit or maybe even an 80 grit ceramic belt and stuff like that. But we do not need tons of clearance for this to work. So I think that should do just fine. And how I go about finishing is I do a 400 grit belt finish, then I hand sand with 400 grit paper. I go from 400 to 400. I don't go backwards. Some folk think that's a little extra work, what have you, but for me, it don't seem to take any more time, I don't think, and it's way less paper I gotta buy. So, I'm going to commence, rip this belt in half, and when I get it set up, I'll bring you around and I'll show you how I'm going about setting it up on my surface grinder attachment for my belt grinder. Okay, I have the knife assembled together again, and I will attempt to show you the results here in the closed position, because that's obviously the important part. Okay, if you notice from here to here, there's a dark line, which is the gap. From here forward, there is no gap, because we only surface ground this section right there. There we go. See that dark line? And on the rest of the blade, there isn't any. That is the clearance that we created by surface grinding that section. Now let's see if we can look at this side. Okay, the light's a little better for whatever reason from this angle. You can see there's a gap from here back, but from here forward, there is no gap. There we go. That's a decent look at the result right there. We have our clearance. We'll replicate that on this side potentially. Ah, there we go. There's our clearance. So I would say this was a success. One thing I would say is it is a little finicky, but it did work. I don't know if I would recommend using a worn 400 grit belt like I did, because I had to be careful with how the depth of my cuts, because it did want to push the blade around a little bit. And I will actually bring you over here real quick. Hopefully I don't make you dizzy. And the mess is quite horrendous, admittedly. Okay, this is the magnetic chuck that I had the blade on, and I put a piece of liner over on the magnetic chuck next to it. That way I could brace the back side of the blade, because it did want to wiggle on me a little bit. So the first side was a learning experience, and the second side was a little bit cleaner. So that is something to take note of the Ameribraid surface grinder. Just has a magnetic chuck in each spot. Like this one right here is an empty one, but it's not a solid chuck. Now if you have one that's a solid chuck, that might go better for you, but the Ameribraid one you have to work with a little bit, to say the least, which is fine. It gets the job done. So I will go ahead and end the video here. I would say that is a good potential way to create clearance. Of course, if you want to really know the, say if you want 5 or 10 thousandths clearance or whatnot, you can use your dial calipers and whatnot to measure to make sure you get the depth you want and so on and so forth. But I do think that is a viable way of doing it, albeit maybe a little finicky. So keep that in mind if you decide to try it. So I'll end the video off here. Till y'all come by and visit me again, y'all take care.